He would lose his gloves, his train, and probably half his paycheck before the night was over, and he still reached for the stranger. The station alarms pulsed in slow red waves across the ceiling, washing the transit hub in the color of a distant emergency no one wanted to claim. Cold vapor spilled from a ruptured coolant vent somewhere above Gate C, curling over the metal floor in ghostly ribbons, and every few seconds the deck gave a low shudder beneath Ethan Carter's boots as another freight shuttle locked into the outer ring. The air tasted like ozone, burnt dust, and old machinery. It was the kind of shift that settled in a man's bones and stayed there. Ethan had just finished 12 hours in maintenance, the reflective strip on his dark work jacket dulled by grease and station grit, his shoulders aching from hauling replacement panels through access shafts barely wide enough for a toolbox. All he wanted was the 11:40 commuter run back to Dockside South, a hot shower if the water recycler was behaving, and 6 hours of sleep before he did it all again. Then he saw the crowd bend around the old alien like water around a stone. Nobody stopped. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. The second was the way the alien's hand trembled against the floor, long pale fingers splayed on the cold plating as if he were trying to hold on to the station itself. He was tall, even folded in on himself, wrapped in a formal travel cloak the color of faded silver, its hem damp from the coolant haze. His face was narrow and lined, the skin a soft violet gray under the flickering lights, and each breath seemed to catch before it fully arrived. A dropped case rolled lazily past him. Boots clicked. Wheels hissed. Voices kept moving. Ethan swore under his breath and changed direction before his mind had time to argue. He set down his tool bag, crouched on one knee, and felt the bite of cold come through the fabric almost instantly. "Easy," he said, though he had no idea if the old man's translator was active. "Don't try to get up yet." The alien looked at him with unfocused eyes, bright as frosted glass, confused more than afraid. Ethan stripped off one insulated glove and pressed 2 fingers lightly to the old man's wrist, searching for anything like a pulse. Too weak to read, but there. Skin like winter metal. Great. Around them, the station kept rushing towards somewhere important. Ethan shrugged out of his outer thermal layer and folded it beneath the stranger's shoulders to keep him off the freezing deck, then tugged his emergency heat pack from his maintenance belt, the last one he had for the walk home, and snapped it hard until it glowed warm between his hands. He tucked it carefully into the alien's cloak near the chest. "Come on," he murmured. "Stay with me." His wrist display flashed a boarding notice for the 11:40. Final call in 3 minutes. He ignored it and keyed station med response instead, only to get a delay notice and a queue line 27 callers deep. Of course. He exhaled through his nose, glanced toward the platform, then back at the old man shivering under the borrowed warmth. Some choices never really felt like choices at all. Ethan slid closer, using his own body to block the worst of the cold vapor, and took the stranger's unsteady hand in both of his bare ones. That was when he heard the woman's voice behind him, clear, controlled, and edged with disbelief sharp enough to cut through alarms, footsteps, and steam. "Why are you touching him?" she asked. "He means nothing to you." Ethan looked up slowly, one hand still wrapped around the old alien's trembling fingers, and for a second the whole station seemed to narrow to the woman standing in the red pulse of the warning lights. She was taller than he expected, maybe 6 feet in her polished dark uniform, the fabric cut with clean silver lines that caught the alarm glow like slivers of ice. Her skin carried the cool sheen of blue-green glass, not bright, not soft, but luminous in a way that made the drifting vapor around her seem dull by comparison. Her eyes were the color of deep water under starlight, sharp and unreadable, fixed on him with the kind of focus that usually belonged to surgeons or judges. Ethan had seen plenty of off-world travelers come through Ring Station, but there was something about this woman that felt engineered for authority. Even her stillness had weight. "Because he is freezing," Ethan said. It came out plainer than he intended, but he was tired and his hands were starting to sting from the cold. The woman's gaze dropped to the thermal layer Ethan had shoved beneath the stranger's shoulders, then to the bare fingers he was using to steady the heat pack inside the old man's cloak. That does not answer the question, she said. Her voice was low, precise, the kind that did not rise when it could cut instead. Ethan glanced at his wrist display again. The 11:40 was gone now, replaced by a quiet notice that the next commuter line to Dockside South would not arrive for another 52 minutes. Great. He swallowed whatever irritation tried to rise and turned his attention back to the stranger. The old man's breathing had eased a little, though every inhale still sounded thin. No, Ethan said, it answers the important part. A few people slowed to watch now that there was a woman in an imperial-looking uniform involved. Ethan could feel their curiosity pressing in from the edges, but none of them stepped forward. None of them offered a blanket, or a hand, or even a question. The woman seemed to notice that too, though her expression did not change. You missed your transport, she said. You used your emergency heat source. You are exposing yourself to coolant inhalation in order to assist a stranger whose condition is already being handled by station systems. This is an irrational trade. Ethan let out a breath that fogged in front of him. Maybe. He adjusted the cloak around the old man's shoulders, careful not to jostle him. But he is still cold right now, and the station system is still 27 calls behind. For the first time, something faint shifted behind her eyes. Not softness. More like interruption. A fact entering a clean equation and refusing to disappear. You expected nothing in return, she asked. Ethan almost laughed, but there was no room for humor in her face, so he let it pass. Lady, I was hoping for a shower and a microwaved dinner. Life is full of disappointment. That earned him the smallest pause. He could not tell if she was offended or trying to decide whether he was serious. Then the old alien stirred under Ethan's hand, his eyelids fluttering open just enough to reveal that same pale, glass-bright gaze. They moved first to Ethan, then to the woman standing over them. Something unreadable passed across his face. Respect, maybe. Recognition, maybe more. Before Ethan could make sense of it, a pair of med-response drones floated through the mist with a soft electrical hum, their white casings blinking blue as they scanned the scene. Relief loosened a knot in Ethan's chest. About time. The drones extended warming panels and a medical field cocoon around the old man with mechanical efficiency, and Ethan slowly pulled his hands back, the cold rushing into them all at once now that the work was no longer his. Pins and needles shot through his fingers. He flexed them once, wincing. The woman watched that small movement with unsettling attention. You are injured, she said. No, Ethan replied, pushing himself to his feet. His knees complained after so long on the deck. I am late. One of the drones emitted a chime, indicating the patient was stable for transport. As the cocoon lifted the old alien gently from the floor, the woman kept her eyes on Ethan, studying him as though he were the stranger now. What is your name? She asked. Ethan grabbed his tool bag and tugged his work jacket tighter against the cold that had already settled into his bones. Ethan Carter. He hesitated, then added, Maintenance Deck 12, when the station decides to collapse in an inconvenient way. Her gaze held his for one quiet beat longer. Lyris Vale, she said. And I do not believe I have ever met anyone who treats inconvenience as a moral philosophy. Ethan looked toward the departing medical cocoon, then back at her luminous, impossible face. It is not philosophy, he said. Sometimes somebody just needs help. The last commuter line Ethan could have caught slid away in a ribbon of white light beyond the station glass, silent and indifferent, and he stood there for a second with the cold working deeper into his hands, watching his own reflection blur across the window. Grease on his sleeve. Frost gathering at the edge of his cuff. Eyes more tired than he felt old enough to own. Behind him, the transit hub had already moved on. The red warning pulse faded back to ordinary station lighting, soft amber strips running along the ceiling, and the smell of coolant slowly gave way to coffee, machine oil, and overheated wiring. Crisis over. Crowd dispersed. Stranger forgotten. That was usually how it went. Ethan shifted his tool bag higher on his shoulder and started toward the service corridor that cut behind the public concourse, boots tapping a tired rhythm against the metal deck. He had made it maybe 30 feet before a clean electronic tone sounded from the wall terminal beside him. Payroll notice. Of course. He pressed his badge to the scanner, and a thin blue screen unfolded in the air. Emergency thermal unit dispensed without supervisor authorization. Replacement cost deducted from next cycle wages. Failure to remain within assigned transit window. Eligibility for punctuality bonus revoked. Ethan stared at the numbers, then let out one dry breath through his nose. There went groceries for half the week. You were penalized, Lyris said. He had not heard her follow him. He turned and found her standing at the mouth of the corridor, the station light catching silver along the seams of her uniform. Without the alarms and drifting vapor, she seemed somehow more controlled, not less. Precise enough to belong in a room with polished stone and sealed doors, not in a maintenance passage lined with utility pipes and scratched access panels. That happens when companies hire people instead of saints, Ethan said. He signed the notice away with a thumbprint and the screen vanished. Lyris stepped closer, her gaze lingering where the blue light had faded. You lost money because of him. Yes. And your transport. Also yes. You still speak as if the matter is settled. Ethan resumed walking, slower this time, and after half a beat she matched his pace without asking permission. The corridor narrowed around them, lined with humming conduit and old inspection labels curling at the corners. Somewhere above, a shuttle engaged its docking clamps with a deep metallic thud that vibrated through the walls. What do you want me to say? He asked. That I regret it? I do not. She folded her hands behind her back. Among my people, regret is not the question. Efficiency is. Ethan gave that a tired sideways glance. That must make funerals very short. Her expression almost changed. Almost. They walked past an open maintenance hatch where warm air spilled out, carrying the dusty smell of recycled heat. Ethan paused long enough to hold his bare hands over the vent. The ache in his fingers sharpened, then softened. It felt good enough to make him close his eyes for a second. When he opened them again, Lyris was still watching him with that unnerving, unblinking focus. Where I come from, she said, aid is structured. Obligations are recorded. Resources are distributed according to rank, kinship, and strategic value. Random sacrifice is considered social instability. Ethan flexed his hands once and started moving again. That sounds lonely. It is orderly, she corrected. Sure. He passed a vending unit, checked his balance, and winced. 2 hot drinks would hurt. 1 would still hurt. He bought them anyway. The machine rattled and hissed before dropping 2 paper cups into the tray, each giving off a thin curl of steam. Ethan handed one to her. Lyris looked at it as if he had offered her a small mechanical animal. I did not request this, she said. I know. Then why? Ethan wrapped both hands around his own cup and felt the heat soak slowly back into his skin. The coffee was terrible. Burnt, bitter, too hot near the lid and lukewarm below. It still tasted like relief. Because you look cold too, he said. For the first time since he had met her, Lyris Vale had no answer at all. Lyris accepted the paper cup with the careful hesitation of someone handling an unfamiliar instrument, her long fingers curling around it as though she expected the heat to explain itself. Steam rose between them in pale threads, briefly softening the hard silver lines of the corridor. Ethan took another swallow of the station coffee and tried not to think about what it would do to his already damaged dinner budget. The vending machine hummed behind them, its lights flickering in a tired loop, and somewhere farther down the passage an air recycler coughed before settling back into its low mechanical drone. It should have been an ordinary end to an ordinary shift. Instead he was standing beside a woman who looked like she belonged in a ceremonial hall, discussing kindness over burnt coffee in a maintenance corridor that smelled faintly of hot dust and antifreeze. Lyris lifted the cup to eye level first, studying the dark liquid through the opening in the lid. "This is a social ritual?" she asked. "For some people it is a survival mechanism," Ethan said. "Tonight it is both." She brought the cup closer, caught the scent, and her expression shifted by a fraction. "It smells like scorched soil." Ethan gave a tired smile. "That means it is fresh." To his surprise, she took a cautious sip. Her eyes narrowed at once. "This is terrible." "That also means it is authentic." For one strange second, Ethan thought she might actually laugh. The sound never came, but something in her posture loosened, just enough to make her seem less like a statue built to disapprove of him. They started walking again, slower now, the cups warming their hands as they moved through the station's narrow service arteries. Pipes ran overhead in neat parallel lines, sweating condensation that caught the amber maintenance lights like beads of glass. At the end of the corridor a wide viewport opened onto the outer docking ring, where cargo skiffs drifted past against the black sweep of space, their guidance lights blinking red and white like patient stars. Ethan had seen that view 1,000 times, but tonight it felt quieter somehow, as if the station itself were listening. "You said it sounded lonely," Lyris said after a while. "My world." "You reached that conclusion very quickly." Ethan shrugged, then regretted it when his shoulders reminded him how long the shift had been. "Maybe I am wrong." "You are." She held the cup near her chest now, more comfortable with it than she had been a minute ago. "Order creates trust. Predictability prevents waste. When every obligation is defined, no one is abandoned by accident." Ethan stopped near the viewport and looked out at the slow traffic beyond the glass. A tug vessel passed close enough that he could make out frost feathered along its hull. "Maybe," he said. "But it sounds like people can still be abandoned on purpose." The words hung between them. Not sharp. Not hostile. Just honest in the way tired people sometimes become when they no longer have energy for performance. Lyris did not answer right away. Her reflection hovered beside his in the window, blue-green skin and silver seams laid over the stars. "Among the Valor," she said at last, "the needs of the many are considered too important to be disrupted by private impulse." Ethan nodded once. "And among humans, private impulse is usually the only reason the many survive the weak." He regretted the line as soon as it left him. It sounded smarter than he felt, more deliberate than it had any right to be. But Lyris did not dismiss it. She turned fully toward him, studying his face as if she were trying to find the machinery behind it. "You truly believe that?" Ethan looked down at the coffee in his hands, at the ripple on its surface each time the station vibrated under distant docking clamps. He thought of the old alien on the floor, of how everyone had curved around him to protect their schedules, their shoes, their comfort, their indifference. He thought of the payroll deduction already waiting in his account and the tired apartment 2 commuter zones away. Then he thought of colder memories, older ones, things he did not usually offer strangers. "When I was 10, he said quietly, my mother got stranded on Interstate 17 outside Denver in a blizzard. Engine dead. No signal. Temperature dropping fast. A trucker she had never met stopped, stayed with her for 3 hours, and gave her his extra thermal blanket until emergency crews found them. He did not know her name. He did not ask who she voted for or what she could give him back. He just saw somebody in trouble and decided that mattered." Lyris said nothing. Ethan could feel her attention sharpen, not into judgment this time, but into something heavier and far more human. He took a breath and continued, his voice softer now. "So no, it is not philosophy. It is memory. It is inheritance. Somebody helps you when they do not have to, and after that the world never looks quite as cold again." For a long moment Lyris did not move. The station lights hummed softly above them, and beyond the viewport a freighter drifted past with its running lamps glowing through a thin veil of ice crystals, each point of light smearing briefly across the glass like a thought that refused to settle. Ethan could hear the quiet paper crackle when her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. It was the only sign that his words had landed anywhere at all. Inheritance, she repeated at last, as if testing the weight of the word on her tongue. You make compassion sound like a family heirloom. Ethan gave a small shrug. Maybe it is. He stared out at the docking ring again, at the slow ballet of cargo tugs and passenger shuttles threading through the dark. Not always by blood. Sometimes by example. Somebody shows you the world does not have to stay cruel just because. It already is, and after that you have a choice. Lyris stood beside him in silence. Close enough for Ethan to feel the faint difference in her warmth now that she had finished half the coffee, not close enough to feel familiar. She seemed to belong to a different law of motion than everyone else on the station, as though she had been built for gravity that expected more dignity from the people inside it. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its blade. On Valor Prime, children are taught that kindness without structure leads to instability. That resources given outside sanctioned obligation produce imbalance. That sentiment weakens systems. Ethan glanced at her. And do you believe that? Her eyes stayed on the stars. I believed it was complete. Something in the answer caught him. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was careful. Honest in the way a person became when they were arguing with themselves and disliked being overheard. Before Ethan could respond, his wrist display chirped again. Maintenance priority ping. He lifted the screen with a tired breath and scanned the notice. Thermal fluctuation in service junction 9. Manual reset required. Estimated duration, 20 minutes. He laughed once under his breath. There goes the rest of my evening. Lyris looked at the floating text, then back at him. You are returning to work. Apparently the station misses me already. He tossed the empty coffee cup into a recycler slot and adjusted the strap of his tool bag. Welcome to modern employment. The machine breaks, the underpaid guy with the wrench gets summoned from the dead. She set her own cup carefully into the slot, as if even disposal deserved precision. I will accompany you. Ethan blinked. You really do not have anything better to do? At the moment, she said, you are more instructive than my scheduled engagements. He started walking before he could think too hard about what that meant. Service Junction 9 sat 2 levels below the public concourse, down a freight lift that smelled like hydraulic fluid and overheated metal. The car rattled on descent, a familiar shiver through the soles of Ethan's boots, and the fluorescent strip overhead flickered with the tired insistence of something overdue for replacement. Lyris stood opposite him, one hand resting lightly against the rail, perfectly balanced despite the vibration. Ethan felt suddenly aware of the grease on his sleeve, the frost line still drying on the hem of his work jacket, the fact that his apartment keys were digging into his pocket because he had skipped dinner and forgotten to empty it. You said the old man's condition was already being handled by station systems, he said as the lift dropped past another deck marker. You sounded pretty sure of that. Lyris met his eyes without hesitation. I was told to observe, not interfere. Ethan frowned. Told by who? The lift doors slid open before she answered, revealing a long utility hall striped in yellow hazard paint and lit by the harsh white glare of service lamps. Warm air rushed out, heavy with the smell of live circuitry. For one beat she remained still in the doorway, her expression unreadable again, composed over whatever truth had almost surfaced. Then she stepped out beside him and said, very quietly, that is a longer story than this corridor deserves. Service Junction 9 sounded like a giant breathing through clenched teeth. Warm air pushed in uneven pulses from the ventilation banks, carrying the dry metallic smell of dust singed on heating coils, and the narrow hall ahead shimmered with the amber light of warning strips embedded along the floor. Ethan crouched beside the access panel at the base of the wall and set his tool bag down with a tired exhale. The deck plating was warmer here than the transit hub above, almost pleasantly so after the cold, but the heat came with its own discomfort, a sticky film that settled under his collar and turned station grime into something that felt permanent. He keyed his badge against the maintenance lock and the panel slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a nest of conduit, thermal regulators, and blinking diagnostic nodes. "There you are," he muttered, more to the station than to himself. One indicator pulsed a stubborn orange instead of green. Fault loop in the thermal relay. Simple on paper. Never simple in practice. Lyris remained a few steps back at first, taking in the cramped corridor, the exposed systems, the scattered labels and handwritten repair notes left by exhausted workers over too many years. Ethan could feel her gaze moving from the open panel to his hands to the faint tremor in his fingers now that the cold had finally given way to fatigue. "You speak to machines as if they have personalities," she said. Ethan pulled a slim driver from his kit and leaned into the housing. After enough years, they earn them. He loosened 2 retaining screws, slid the relay casing free, and winced when a rush of trapped heat brushed across his knuckles. This one is moody, underfunded, and one more bad decision away from ruining everybody's night. So, basically management. Lyris stood closer this time, close enough to see the reflection of the blinking diagnostics in her eyes. "You joke often when you are tired. That is because the alternatives are expensive." Ethan set the faulty relay on the deck, wiped his hand on a rag, and reached for the spare coupler clipped inside the panel frame. He paused when he saw it. Empty bracket. He checked the lower tray. Empty there too. Of course. He let his head tip back against the wall for 1 second and closed his eyes. "Do not tell me," Lyris said quietly. "Let me guess. The part you require has not been supplied." Ethan opened his eyes again. "You are learning." He scrolled through the terminal display mounted inside the panel and found the note he had expected. Replacement coupler requisitioned. Awaiting approval. Estimated delay, 14 hours. Ethan gave a short laugh with no humor in it at all. Beautiful. The warning strip along the floor shifted from amber to a deeper orange as the thermal fluctuation cycled again. Somewhere farther down the corridor, a vent gave off a sharp rattle and then steadied. Ethan rubbed a hand across his face, feeling the grit on his skin. "All right," he said. "We do this the ugly way." He dug through his bag and pulled out a multipurpose bypass ring, old but serviceable, then a coil of insulated line he had been saving for a job that technically mattered more. Lyris watched every movement. "You are improvising. That is a generous word for it." He threaded the line through the relay housing with practiced fingers. "I am convincing a failing system to behave long enough for payroll to forget I exist." For the first time since entering the corridor, Lyris lowered herself to one knee beside him, careless of the polished fabric of her uniform touching the dusty deck. The motion startled Ethan enough that he nearly dropped the coupler ring. Up close, he could see tiny silver iridescence under her blue-green skin, like frost suspended beneath glass. "Tell me what to hold," she said. Ethan stared at her for half a beat. "You do not have to do that." "No," she replied, meeting his eyes with calm, unwavering focus. "But apparently that is not the standard you use." Something warm and quiet moved through him then, not relief exactly, not surprise alone, but the strange weight of seeing an idea take root in real time. He handed her the line. "Hold this steady," he said. "If it slips, the whole loop resets and I get to spend another hour pretending I love my job." Lyris took the cable carefully, her long fingers firm and exact. "Understood." Ethan turned back to the panel, but the corridor did not feel quite as narrow anymore. The bypass ring clicked into place with a sound so small it almost disappeared beneath the steady hum of the junction, but Ethan felt the system respond through his fingertips before the diagnostic panel confirmed it. The orange fault light flickered once, twice, then softened to green. Air moved differently through the vents a second later, smoother now, less strained, the whole corridor seeming to exhale after holding tension too long. Ethan tightened the last contact point, leaned back on his heels, and rolled the stiffness out of one shoulder. "There," he said. "Temporary fix." Which is station language for permanent until something catches fire on a more important deck. Lyris did not release the line until he nodded. When she finally let go, she studied the repaired assembly with a concentration that suggested she was memorizing not only the mechanism, but the choice behind it. "You used the part meant for another system," she said. Ethan began resealing the panel, each screw turning home with familiar resistance. "A lower priority one." "According to whose ranking?" "Mine." He slid the casing shut and slapped the side of it once, lightly, out of habit. The vent ahead gave a cleaner rush of warmth in answer. "Good enough." He gathered his tools slowly, fatigue settling over him with the heavy certainty of gravity. The adrenaline from the transit hub had burned off, leaving only the ache in his back, the roughness in his throat from station air, and the dull reminder that he still had a 40-minute ride standing between him and sleep. Lyris remained kneeling. For a moment after the work was done, her gaze lowered to the deck plating where dust and amber light pooled in the shallow seams. "On Valor," she said quietly, "this corridor would still be cold." Ethan looked over at her. "Because there was no approved part. Because no one with your rank would be permitted to alter the allocation model without authorization from 3 departments and a civic steward." She rose in one fluid motion, too graceful for the setting, then brushed a trace of dust from the knee of her uniform with absent precision. "And no one with mine would be expected to kneel on a maintenance floor holding a live line for a station worker." Ethan slung the tool bag over his shoulder. "Sounds exhausting." "It is efficient." He raised an eyebrow. Lyris looked toward the now stable relay, listened to the balanced rhythm of the vents, and for the first time since he had met her, she let silence disagree with her. The moment stretched between them, not awkward, just strangely full. Ethan found himself wondering what her life looked like when it was not filtered through station corridors and emergency lights. Rooms with too much glass. Ceremonies spoken in formal cadence. Schedules written by people who had never repaired anything with their own hands. She turned to him again, and there was something different in her face now, not softness exactly, but a kind of unsettled clarity, as though a window had opened somewhere inside her and she was not sure whether to close it. "The elder you helped," she said. "If you had known who he was, would your choice have changed?" Ethan did not answer immediately. He hooked his badge back onto his jacket, then glanced down the corridor where the warning strips had faded from orange to calm white. The station felt almost peaceful now, in the tired industrial way machines had when they were finally working and no one was yelling at them. "No," he said. "Would have made the paperwork more annoying, maybe. But not the choice." Lyris held his gaze, searching for the flaw in the answer, the angle, the performance. Whatever she found there, it made her draw one slow breath. "Then I misjudged your species," she said. Ethan started walking toward the freight lift, and after only the smallest hesitation, she walked beside him again. "Do not worry," he said. "Humans are still a mess. We just occasionally surprise ourselves." This time the sound that left her was unmistakable. Not a laugh exactly, but close enough to warm the corridor more than the repaired vents had. And as they reached the lift doors, Ethan realized with quiet surprise that he no longer felt like he was being studied by a stranger. He felt like he was walking beside someone standing at the edge of a belief she had been taught all her life, and for the first time, she was looking down. The freight lift carried them upward through the station with a low mechanical groan, deck numbers sliding past in pale blue on the wall display while warm air slowly gave way to the cooler, drier atmosphere of the transit levels above. Ethan leaned back against the metal rail and let his eyes close for a second, not enough to sleep, just enough to feel how tired he really was. Every muscle in his shoulder seemed to hum with its own private complaint. Across from him, Lyris stood with one hand resting lightly against the lift wall, her posture still exact, but something about her looked less distant now, as if the station had put a thin layer of reality over all that polished composure. There was dust on the knee of her uniform she had missed, and the sight of it gave Ethan a quiet, unreasonable satisfaction. When the doors opened, the late-night concourse greeted them with softer light and thinner crowds. Most of the rush was gone. The polished floor reflected long amber lines from the overhead fixtures, and the loudest sounds now were rolling luggage, distant boarding announcements, and the steady hiss of automated cleaners gliding along the edges of the terminal. A family of miners slept in a cluster near Gate 11, jackets pulled over their shoulders. A human teenager in a station apron handed a cup of soup across a kiosk counter to a dockworker who looked too tired to speak. Two alien children, one with bright copper skin and one with pale blue, shared a packet of crackers while their mother argued quietly with a transit screen that had clearly stopped caring an hour ago. Lyris slowed as she took it all in. "They do this constantly," she said. Ethan followed her gaze. "Do what?" "These small exchanges. Food. Seats. Directions. Warmth. They are not bonded by rank or kinship." Ethan adjusted the strap of his tool bag. "It is a station. People get stuck. You help where you can. Without being told." He gave her a tired sideways look. "That is usually how helping works." They reached the commuter platform just as the next Dockside South line was marked delayed by another 18 minutes. Ethan looked at the board, then at the empty feeling behind his ribs, and decided pride was less useful than calories. A vending cart near the far column still had its lights on. He bought the cheapest thing it offered, a sealed sandwich that tasted like chilled cardboard and pepper, and a bottle of water. He hesitated, then bought a second sandwich because apparently his financial judgment had fully given up for the night. He handed one to Lyris. She accepted it with less hesitation this time. "Progress. You keep doing that," she said. "Offering things." Ethan unscrewed the water cap. "You keep being around when I have food. That is not destiny. That is bad timing." But Lyris did not look amused. She was watching the platform again, the old metallic shine of the rails, the faces lit by schedules and fatigue and patience. "Valor is strong," she said quietly. "Our ships are among the fastest in the spiral. Our worlds are ordered. Our cities function with mathematical precision. And yet in the outer provinces, supply lines fail more often each cycle. Civil petitions increase. Local governors blame one another. Trade convoys wait for approval while settlements ration heat and medicine because no one wishes to exceed authority." Ethan turned fully toward her. The sandwich paused halfway to his mouth. "You are telling me an empire that can cross star systems forgets how to make a decision without paperwork?" "I am telling you," Lyris said, her voice dropping lower, more personal now, "that we have built a civilization so afraid of disorder that people have begun to confuse obedience with virtue." A train roared through the opposite track without stopping, its passing wind stirring the loose edge of Ethan's jacket and lifting a strand of silver-dark hair from Lyris's temple. She did not seem to notice. Her eyes stayed fixed on the platform, on a human woman tucking her scarf around a sleeping stranger's child because the child's mother had fallen asleep sitting up. No one announced it. No one recorded it. No one praised it. It simply happened, small and quiet and human. "That is why the elder mattered to you," Ethan said. Lyris looked at him then, and the station noise seemed to fall farther away. "Yes," she said. "And that is why your answer is becoming dangerous." The words settled between them like a pressure change before a storm. Ethan lowered the sandwich slowly, no longer hungry enough to pretend he had not heard her. Around them the platform kept moving in its tired midnight rhythm, announcements chiming overhead in 3 languages, a maintenance drone gliding past with soft blue lights, the smell of reheated broth and machine oil drifting through the conditioned air. Ordinary life, carrying on as if she had not just told him his way of thinking could be a threat to an empire. "Dangerous to who?" he asked. Lyris did not answer at once. She seemed to be choosing each word before it reached the air, which somehow made them feel heavier. To any system that depends on people believing that duty ends where obligation ends, she said at last. Your answer is simple. That is what makes it difficult to defend against. Ethan gave a tired, disbelieving breath through his nose. I am a maintenance worker with a missing punctuality bonus and a sandwich that tastes like industrial foam. I do not think anyone is building policy around me. Not around you, Lyris said. Around what you reveal. A low chime sounded from the platform edge, warning of an inbound transport on a distant track, and the polished floor picked up a faint vibration under Ethan's boots. He looked past her toward the sleeping family near gate 11, the dockworker with the soup, the woman still tucking the scarf more securely around a child who was not hers. None of them looked revolutionary. They looked tired. They looked ordinary. Maybe that was the point. You make it sound like kindness is contraband, he said. Lyris turned toward the tracks, hands folded lightly in front of her, her reflection stretched thin in the dark glass barrier behind the rails. On Valor, compassion exists, she said. But it is organized. Assigned. Measured. Approved. It flows downward through designated channels so the structure remains intact. What you do here is different. It moves sideways. Freely. Uncommanded. No one controls it. So no one can predict where loyalty will form. Ethan frowned. Loyalty? Yes. Her eyes lifted to the transit board, but Ethan had the feeling she was seeing something much farther away than delayed commuter lines. Empires do not survive on force alone. They survive because people believe the structure above them deserves their trust. But if a stranger offers warmth faster than a government offers relief, people begin to notice. If a station worker gives away his last heat pack while officials wait for authorization, people begin to compare. And once they compare, they ask dangerous questions. Ethan stood very still. He thought of the old alien on the freezing floor, of the medresponse Q-27 calls deep, of payroll deductions landing faster than help. He thought of all the little ways systems protected themselves by calling human delay inevitable and human need unfortunate. Was that why you were there? He asked quietly. At the transit hub. To watch whether your people would help. Lyris's jaw tightened by the smallest degree. Not fear. Not shame. Something closer to conflict. I was there because the elder wished to travel without announcement, she said. He said he wanted to see how civilizations behave when no one knows they are being evaluated. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Evaluated by who? This time she looked directly at him, and the composure in her face did not break, but it changed shape. The polished distance was still there, yet beneath it something more human had begun to show through, something tired and honest and perhaps a little afraid of what came next. By a man whose opinion can alter trade law, provincial authority, and relief policy across 71 inhabited worlds, she said. Ethan felt the station noise recede for a second, not because it had actually quieted, but because his mind had stepped away from it. You are telling me the old man on the floor was not just some traveler. No, Lyris said. I am telling you that Chancellor Thalen Oris, acting head of the Valor Imperial Council, collapsed in public while half the station looked away. The approaching train thundered through the tunnel then, wind pushing across the platform hard enough to tug at Ethan's jacket and send a cold whisper over his face. But even with the noise rising all around them, he heard her next words with perfect clarity. And you were the only one who helped before anyone knew his name. Ethan did not answer right away because his mind had stopped in two different places at once. One part of him was still back on the freezing deck beside a stranger in a silver travel cloak, replaying every simple movement with the new and absurd weight of what that stranger had actually been. The other part stood on the commuter platform under humming lights and a delayed transit board, holding half a sandwich and wondering how a night that should have ended with a shower had somehow turned into a conversation about the moral architecture of an empire. The train doors slid open across the platform with a soft hydraulic sigh, passengers stepping off in weary silence, but Ethan did not move. You let me talk to him like he was anybody, he said at last. Lyris held his gaze with that same quiet precision, though now it carried something more difficult than judgment. That was the point, she said. He did not want protocol. He wanted truth. Ethan let out a slow breath and looked away, past the tracks, past the mirrored barrier, into the dark reflection of the station layered over the stars. And did he get it? Yes, Lyris said. More clearly than I think either of us expected. Before Ethan could decide whether that was flattering or deeply inconvenient, every light along the platform flickered once. Then twice. A low chime rolled overhead, not the polite transit tone they had been hearing all night, but a deeper station-wide alert that seemed to come from the bones of the structure itself. The air changed first. Not colder, not hotter, but thinner somehow, drier, touched by the metallic sting of overworked systems. Passengers looked up in unison. The wall displays blinked, dissolved into static, then reformed into emergency routing maps striped in amber and white. Automated voice, attention. Thermal containment instability detected in refugee intake sector 4. Access corridors temporarily restricted pending administrative override. Ethan felt the words hit him like bad déjà vu. Administrative override. Across the platform, the woman with the sleeping child was already awake, pulling the scarf tighter and searching the signs with sudden alarm. Near the kiosk, the dockworker set down his cup and swore softly under his breath. A second announcement followed, colder this time. Shuttle arrivals from Valor outer colonies delayed. In quarantine berths. Medical processing suspended until clearance codes are received. Ethan turned sharply toward Lyris. He did not need to ask if the coincidence was real. Her face had gone very still, all the warmth of the last hour sheathed behind official focus. A thin band of blue light had appeared at her wrist, projecting a stream of text across her forearm in rapid alien script. For the first time since he met her, she looked not composed, but cornered by time. "What is intake sector 4?" Ethan asked. "A temporary shelter ring," she said without looking up. "Mostly civilian arrivals from the Valor frontier. Families. Supply crews. Medical transfers. Their thermal grid was supposed to be replaced 2 cycles ago." Ethan stared at her. "Supposed to be?" She finally looked up, and there was no distance left in her voice now, only urgency. Approval stalled between provincial offices. The platform lights dimmed another fraction. Somewhere far below, a heavy mechanical shudder ran through the station, followed by the faint, unmistakable groan of stressed infrastructure trying not to fail in public. People were moving now, not panicking, but close enough that the difference no longer felt comforting. Ethan could smell overheated wiring under the station air fresheners. He knew that smell. It meant systems were compensating hard and losing the argument. Another line of text flashed across Lyris's wrist display. She read it, and something in her expression changed so completely that Ethan felt his own pulse answer. "The quarantine doors are still locked," she said. "Relief teams are waiting for council release codes." Ethan heard the old question echo in his head with brutal clarity. "Why are you touching him?" He looked toward the emergency map, then toward the families on the platform, then back at Lyris. "How far is Sector 4? Lyris blinked once, startled not by the question, but by how quickly he asked it. 3 levels down. East intake ring." Ethan dropped the rest of the sandwich into the recycler without a second thought and hit the call control for the service lift instead of boarding his train. "Then let us hope your empire appreciates inconvenient people," he said, already moving. The service lift dropped fast enough to make Ethan feel it behind his ribs. The walls trembled with each passing level, and the thin strip lights overhead flashed from white to amber and back. Again, painting Lyris's face in alternating bands of calm and alarm. He could smell hot metal now, stronger than before, threaded with that dry electrical scent that always meant a system was pushing past the point where engineers liked to admit it. On the display above the door, deck numbers slid downward in a blur, 12, 11, 10. Lyrisa's wrist projection filled the narrow car with pale blue script and shifting station schematics. Sector 4 is still in restricted containment, she said. 3 intake corridors are sealed. Internal heat loss has reached critical displacement in 2 family housing wings. Ethan tightened his grip on the rail as the lift lurched. In English. Her eyes flicked to him. The shelter is getting colder faster than the system can compensate. Better. The doors opened on level 9 to a corridor already crowded with stranded personnel. Medical staff in gray station coats stood near a locked security gate with portable warmers stacked beside them, their faces tight with the kind of helpless frustration Ethan had seen too many times. A pair of freight handlers argued with a transit officer over access codes. Beyond the transparent barrier, the intake wing stretched into a haze of white overhead lighting and rising vapor, full of rows of temporary housing pods and moving figures wrapped in blankets. Even from here Ethan could see parents holding children close, workers rubbing warmth into their hands, volunteers trying to distribute supplies through a door that would not open. Too many people. Too much waiting. Not enough time. The station officer straightened when he saw Lyris. "Ma'am, we are awaiting council release confirmation. Until then these doors stay sealed." Lyris stepped forward, every inch of her posture turning formal again. "I am issuing provisional authority under Valor Diplomatic Emergency Clause 7. The officer hesitated only half a second before shaking his head. "Your credentials are recognized, ma'am, but the intake sector is under quarantine lock. The doors are tied to central administrative consensus. I need 3 matching signatures or a direct council release." Ethan stared at him. "People are freezing behind the glass and your system wants a group project?" The officer looked exhausted rather than cruel, which somehow made it worse. "Sir, if I break protocol and trigger a containment penalty, the entire ring can hard seal." Lyrisa's jaw tightened. She lifted her wrist again, sent a burst of code into the gate, and waited. Red text flashed back. "Override denied. Council relay pending. Estimated authorization delay, 56 minutes. Ethan felt something inside him go cold in a way the station temperature never could. He stepped away from the argument and followed the gate's cable trunk with his eyes to the wall junction beside the intake barrier. Security lock, thermal relay, emergency vent control, all tied into one ugly cluster of panels. Old hardware married to new software, which meant exactly the kind of design choice that made disasters look very official while they were unfolding. He dropped to one knee in front of the access plate and pulled his driver from his tool bag. "What are you doing?" the officer snapped. "Preventing your paperwork from outliving your civilians." The first screw came loose under his hand, then the second. Lyris moved instantly, taking position beside him, her presence cutting through the rising noise around them. "If you open that line," she said quietly, "you could trip the quarantine seal." Ethan slid the panel free and felt warm air rush over his knuckles from an overworked control bank. "And if I do nothing?" Lyris looked through the barrier at the families huddled under failing heat lamps, at a child pressing both hands to the glass because he did not understand why the adults with supplies were still outside. When she turned back, the conflict on her face lasted only a breath. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder and far more dangerous than obedience. "Then I will be standing in the wrong empire," she said. Ethan gave her the bypass line from his bag without looking up. "Hold this steady." This time she did not hesitate at all. Ethan worked by feel as much as sight now. The panel in front of him was a crowded tangle of thermal routing, quarantine locks, and administrative safeguards layered over one another by people who had probably never stood in a corridor listening to children shiver behind sealed glass. The metal inside the housing radiated dry heat against his hands, and every few seconds a warning pulse ran through the line Lyris was holding, turning the pale skin of her fingers blue-white in the flickering light. Around them the intake hall had become a pressure chamber of restrained fear. Medical staff shifted from foot to foot with blankets and portable warmers stacked uselessly at their knees. Inside the barrier, parents held their families close beneath failing heat lamps while station volunteers moved from pod to pod with the frantic efficiency of people trying not to let panic become visible. Ethan found the relay bridge, traced the security loop past the quarantine node, and understood the problem at once. They tied the door lock to the thermal stabilizers, he said, more sharply than he meant to. If the software thinks the quarantine field is unstable, it diverts power from environmental recovery to barrier integrity. Lyris's eyes lifted from the cable to his face. Meaning? Meaning whoever designed this system decided the door mattered more than the people. The station officer flinched as if the words had struck him personally. Maybe they had. Ethan reached deeper into the housing, fingertips searching past bundled lines and old junction tags until he found the manual fail-safe ring buried behind the admin relay. It had been capped with a tamper seal so thin and polished it looked ceremonial, which told him everything he needed to know about the kind of culture that built it. I can reopen the heat transfer and release one corridor, he said. Not all three. Not cleanly. But enough to get relief teams through and start moving families. Do it, Lyris said immediately. The officer opened his mouth, but she cut across him without raising her voice. I will assume responsibility. Something in her tone reached farther than rank. The officer stepped back. Ethan twisted the fail-safe ring. Nothing. He tried again, harder this time, and felt the mechanism resist with the stubbornness of something untouched for years. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck despite the cold beyond the barrier. Come on, he muttered. He braced one shoulder against the wall and turned with both hands. The ring broke loose with a metallic snap that echoed down the corridor. Instantly the control bank spat a storm of status lights across the panel. Amber. White. Green. The intake barrier gave a deep mechanical shudder, and one section of the sealed door slid upward 6 inches, then a foot, then all the way open with a rush of warmer air and the sharp, human sound of relief released all at once. Medical teams surged forward with blankets, heaters, and portable med kits. Volunteers moved with them. Inside the shelter, faces turned toward the opening. Not with cheering, but with that quieter look people got when they had spent too long preparing for disappointment and did not yet trust the miracle. Ethan sat back on his heels, breath leaving him hard, hands shaking now that the work was done. The warning pulse on the wall display softened. Thermal flow returning. Environmental stabilization in progress. He let his head tip briefly against the metal frame and closed his eyes for one exhausted second. When he opened them, he saw a figure standing just beyond the newly opened corridor surrounded by a small cluster of stunned officials who had clearly arrived too late to be useful. The old alien from the station floor no longer looked frail. He still wore the silver cloak, but now it sat on him like office instead of fabric, and his pale, glass-bright eyes were very clear as they settled first on the open barrier, then on Ethan, then on Lyris kneeling on a maintenance deck with a cable in her hands and dust on her uniform. Chancellor Thalen Oris crossed the threshold slowly, as though he wished to feel every foot of distance between policy and consequence. He stopped in front of them and for a moment said nothing at all. Then his gaze moved to the families being wrapped in warmth behind him, to the relief teams finally flowing where bureaucracy had stalled, and his voice, when it came, was quiet enough that everyone nearby leaned in to hear it. So this, he said, looking at Ethan with something deeper than gratitude in his ancient eyes, is what my empire has been missing. For a second Ethan thought the Chancellor was speaking to someone behind him. He was still on one knee beside the open panel, palms streaked with dust and heat, shirt clinging uncomfortably between his shoulders, pulse beating hard in his throat from effort and station air and the sheer absurdity of hearing a sentence like that from the man half a quadrant apparently answered to. Around them the corridor had changed its sound. The sharp edge of panic was gone now, replaced by the rustle of thermal blankets, the soft whir of portable heaters, the hurried but steadier footsteps of med teams finally moving where they were needed. Warm air flowed through the intake ring again, not perfect, not even, but enough that children were no longer pressed against the glass for heat. Ethan pushed himself upright slowly, every joint protesting. Sir, he said, because it seemed safer than attempting anything more intelligent. Chancellor Thalen Oris looked at him for a long, unreadable moment, then turned slightly so the officials clustered behind him, the station officers at the gate, and the volunteers filling the corridor could hear. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Age had worn it smooth, but not weak. I crossed these systems in silence because reports can be polished, numbers can be managed, and ceremonies can hide rot beneath gold, he said. I wish to see my empire without its stage lights. His pale eyes shifted to the reopened corridor, to the families being wrapped in warmth by strangers who had not asked for names or status before helping. What I found was efficiency without mercy, order without courage, and procedure that mistook delay for wisdom. No one moved. Even the station seemed to listen. Thalen's gaze returned to Ethan. Earlier tonight, I collapsed in a public transit hall while citizens, officials, and travelers passed me by because I was unknown to them. This human was the only one who acted before identity could flatter him. Ethan felt every eye in the corridor settle on him and wanted, with a sincerity bordering on pain, to be anywhere else. Lyris stood beside him still holding the bypass line, dust on her uniform, her expression quiet but transformed, as if something inside her had finally chosen a side. The Chancellor looked at her next. Advisor Vale, he said, you asked him the question, did you not? Lyris drew one measured breath. Yes, Chancellor. Then ask it again. Let them hear it. She turned toward Ethan. There was no mockery left in her now, no cold curiosity, only a gravity that made the simple words feel larger than decrees. Why do humans help strangers? Ethan glanced past her toward the open shelter wing. A human medic was kneeling to wrap a heating band around the hands of an alien cargo worker. A station janitor had given up his own coat to an exhausted mother rocking a child to sleep. No one was making speeches. No one was waiting for permission. They were simply doing what needed doing because someone in front of them was cold, or tired, or afraid. The answer came. To him not like something clever, but like something old and true. Because the moment we stop, he said softly, the universe gets colder. Silence followed, deep and complete. Then Thalen bowed his head, not with imperial distance, but with the unmistakable humility of someone receiving a truth he had needed for far too long. Then let the record show, he said, straightening, that tonight a maintenance worker from Earth reminded the Valar Empire what civilization is for. Orders moved after that with a speed Ethan had not known bureaucracy could achieve. Quarantine locks were revised. Relief authority was decentralized. Intake protocols were rewritten before dawn. But what Ethan remembered most was not the officials hurrying to obey or the officers suddenly finding their courage once policy shifted. It was the quieter thing. An hour later, when the worst of the crisis had passed, he stood with Lyris at the long station window overlooking the departure berths. Rescue shuttles lifted one by one into the dark, their engine glow painting silver across the glass. She stood close enough for him to feel her warmth in the cool light, not touching, not needing to. You have made my life very complicated, she said. Ethan managed a tired smile. That seems to be going around. Lyris watched the ships climb toward the stars her people had once believed were held together by order alone. No, she said, her voice almost lost beneath the distant hum of engines. You made it honest. Ethan looked out at the shuttles carrying warmth, medicine, and people willing to arrive before permission did, and for the first time that night, the station did not feel